All right, students, go ahead and title your notes Evolution by Natural Selection. And that's kind of the broader topic, but we're going to set the stage here with the kind of the original hypothesis that most people had of life forms and how they originated. So we're going to call that instantaneous creation. And that has some implications. That is that species are static, which means not changing. Right? And the other implication then would be that those different species are not related either. So what Darwin brought about, and Lamarck as well, was a new idea. That is that all species are related by descent. In other words, they all descended from a single common ancestor. And so if you've ever looked at the tree of life and how all modern species have originated from a single point, that's what this is referring to. So the implication here then would be that species evolve, which is another way of saying that they change. Okay, so it's quite a claim, right? And it's going to require a lot of evidence to support this. But a lot of people at this period in time held the view of instantaneous creation, and you can't really blame people for thinking that, because we had a limited knowledge, and also during our lifetime, we don't really ever see species change, right? You only live to be 80 years, right? 90 years if you're lucky. And during those 80 or 90 years, you don't see anything evolve. Everything stays the same. In fact, all you ever see is species giving birth to the same species. And so we just don't see change in our lifetime. And so it's very easy to conclude that the species are static and that they don't change. But when you throw millions of years into the picture with gradual changes, then that's when the bigger changes can accumulate. So we just want to keep in mind here that the theory that makes, because it's like, how do you decide between these two theories? And the way you know you've got a good theory is if it makes accurate predictions and if it makes sense of observations. Right? And then, yeah, so making sense of observations and making accurate predictions. And we will see that by far, hypothesis 2 wins that contest. It makes very accurate predictions, and it also makes sense of things that would otherwise be very mysterious, observations that would otherwise be very mysterious if instantaneous creation were the way that these species came about. Okay, so we're going to start with some key observations. We're going to start with somebody, Lyell. Okay, Lyell was a scientist. He made many observations of extinct life forms. So he found these. He discovered extinction, basically. So he found many extinct life forms in the fossil strata. The reason this is significant is because, once again, if this is an observation, right? This is what I'm talking about. And to make sense of this observation, you've got all these extinct life forms. Why are they there? Why are they buried so far down in the earth? And why do they not exist today? Right? And hypothesis 2 would have a very Well, hypothesis 2 would actually predict that. If species are coming into existence and going out of existence, then we would expect in the fossil record to find species that once existed that do not exist today. So we would give a point to hypothesis 2 there already. Okay, so this also has another implication, and that is that the Earth is very old. If you go back 200, 300 years ago, we didn't have any idea as to the age of the Earth. Some people put it in the thousands, but we now believe that it is in the billions, and that life itself is over 3 billion years old. So the difference between thousands and billions is huge. So our understanding of this age of the Earth has changed dramatically in a short period of time. I want to introduce you to another man by the name of Lamarck. Lamarck was famous for his acquired characteristics. And if we look at the word here, acquired means to attain something, right? You receive this characteristic during your lifetime. And that's why he called it an acquired characteristic. And the way that we define this is that this would be like a change to an individual during its lifetime. That can be passed on to offspring. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of a funny example. Say that you have a giraffe, and the giraffe is reaching for leaves on higher up branches. Well, the stretching action, the repeated stretching, is going to stretch the giraffe's neck. Its neck will get longer as that giraffe ages. And then when that giraffe reproduces, the longer neck that giraffe acquired gets passed on to its offspring. Kind of through traits, or you could say traits are acquired through exertion, I guess you could say. Like a giraffe stretching its neck. So it turns out that this is not completely true. In fact, it's pretty far from being true. However, as we learned in the last unit, the field of epigenetics is growing, and we're learning that Lamarck was more correct than we once thought, and that sometimes changes do occur to our genome, not the genetic sequence, but there are mechanisms of epigenetic modification that can be acquired during one's life and passed on. And that's, in some sense, kind of like an acquired characteristic. Now, it's not as extreme and exaggerated as what Lamarck had proposed, but he was kind of correct in some ways. But we want to say that Mendelian genetics and Darwin's model of natural selection have replaced, or have disproved, I guess we could say, but epigenetics is showing Lamarck was partly correct. Mechanisms of methylation, etc. Gene methylation. We talked about that in Unit 6 a little bit. All right, moving right along here. So let's zoom in now on Darwin and the things that he observed. So we hit on Lamarck, we hit on Lyell. let's move on to Darwin and talk about what he saw and what he was thinking. So let's first hit on his conclusions. So the conclusion that he made was that natural selection, rather than acquired characteristics, was the mechanism of evolution. And so what he meant by that was that there are certain traits, adaptations, that nature would select for or weed out of the population. And so as time goes on, those favorable traits begin to increase in frequency. So we'll talk more about the mechanisms of natural selection, but first let's look at some of Darwin's own language and some of the things that he saw and some of the ways in which he processed what he saw. So he used the words vague and arbitrary to describe the differences between species. On different islands. So we all know about the trip he took to the Galapagos, and he noticed that many of the surrounding islands all had their own version of the tortoise, or all had their own version of the finch, right? But that these differences between these species were very vague and seemingly arbitrary. And that kind of surprised Darwin. So, because again, if we are thinking with the mind of, say that there was some kind of designer who was designing and then after designing, planting these species in different parts, it would be strange for that designer to create vague and arbitrary differences. It wouldn't really make sense, right? Like if you're thinking like if I were to make species, if I were to create species and then place them, I wouldn't make them so random, like so similar and so randomly similar. But what does kind of explain this vague and arbitrary differences is perhaps a model of descent with modification. So Darwin thought this suggested descent with modification. So what this means is that maybe there was a mainland tortoise, okay, that inhabited the mainland, then diverged and inhabited different islands, and then evolutionary change, led to some changes, let's say, right? So the mainland tortoise moves to the islands, time passes, plus you've got different conditions, different environmental factors, and different environmental challenges, we could say. And over time, that mainland tortoise acquired those vague and arbitrary differences that Darwin noticed. All right, so we could say vague and arbitrary differences between the tortoise species. It's like they're almost the same species, but not quite. So what explains that? Darwin suggested that it was that they separated geographically, right? They're all on different islands, so they can't interbreed anymore. Okay, so this brings us to another term called endemism. And endemism is when species exist in one place but nowhere else on the earth. And Darwin saw a lot of examples of endemism. The island tortoises were examples. He saw certain finches that existed only in particular islands. He saw this type of swimming iguana that is found only on a particular island in the Galapagos. And so again, this is further support of this idea of descent with modification. All right, now in Darwin's journal, we can see him using the word adaptation, and that is a heritable characteristic. By the way, we're going to qualify this term heritable. We're going to say that it was acquired at conception. So this would be where Darwin would differ a little bit from Lamarck. Lamarck believed that you could acquire a characteristic after conception. In other words, at some point during your life, you could acquire it. Darwin, building off of Mendel, believed that these traits were acquired at conception, which means at the precise moment that the sperm cell fertilized the egg cell, the traits were determined at that point. So it's an heritable characteristic that increases fitness. So what is fitness? Well, we have to be careful with the word fitness because it has a modern day meaning that is not what Darwin meant. Darwin's definition of fitness was biological fitness, and that would be level of reproductive success. So we can give you kind of a funny example. Say you had like an immortal, all-powerful, yet infertile grizzly bear. So we're talking about a bear that is so large and so strong that it can outcompete any other grizzly bear for anything. It can outcompete for mates. It can outcompete for food, shelter, habitat, everything. It is extremely physically fit, but there's a catch. It's infertile. So it tries to mate with other female grizzly bears, but the grizzly does not produce viable gametes, and so it cannot reproduce. Even though this grizzly bear is extremely physically fit, its biological fitness is 0, because biological fitness only concerns reproductive success. So compare that to a weaker grizzly that succeeds at reproducing. So even though we have a weaker grizzly, its reproductive success or its fitness is much, much higher than, say, the giant grizzly. So that's just an example I like to use to contrast and really kind of clarify Darwin's definition for fitness. Okay, let's look at a couple notable adaptations. So Darwin uses this word adaptation. So we are expecting to see here some kind of some kind of heritable trait that increases the individual's ability to reproduce. So one of the things that Darwin saw was beak depth in finches. So you could have like kind of this tweezer-like beak for getting bugs. And then he saw kind of a stouter beak for cracking seeds or nuts. He also saw, well, actually, he didn't see this, but this is my own example. Hairy elephants during the Ice Age. The hair was to conserve body heat, right? There's all kinds of examples. We can go on and on. These examples here work to help organisms survive. And the reason that increases reproductive success is because you have to survive in order to reproduce. So this increases likelihood of reproduction. Okay, so those are adaptations. There are countless adaptations, examples that we could go into. Okay, so let's look now at this mechanism of natural selection. So natural selection has 4 points. 4 main points. The first main point is that we have to have variation. In other words, individuals, also known as offspring, have variation. Okay, so how do we get that variation? There's 2 ways. One is meiosis, can lead to genetic variation, which can lead to differential reproductive success. Some of the offspring may be more successful at surviving and reproducing because there's differences among the offspring. There's also mutation, which is the source of new alleles. So when we referred to the genetic variation up here, we're talking about new combinations. But when we're talking about new alleles, brand new traits, mutation is our source for those. And they also lead to differential reproductive success. By the way, the overwhelming majority of mutations are either neutral or harmful, but it's the far minority of mutations are actually adaptive. Overpopulation. We have to have overpopulation. And by the way, all species have a tendency toward overpopulation. It's hardwired into them to just breed, reproduce. It's a human thing to actually look at the world population and ask, are we overpopulating the planet? Like, we're the only species who's ever asked that question. So you can assume that like if we're talking about the snails in Mr. Ross Aquarium, the snails, they will reproduce as much as they possibly can. They'll produce thousands and thousands and thousands of snails, even if that tank can only hold 100. And so you'll just see a massive die-off. But, and what this means is that individuals produce more offspring than the environment can support. And this is important because it drives up competition. When we have more competition for space and more competition for resources, competition is higher, which increases the forces of natural selection. So you got overpopulation, which leads to increased competition, which leads to increased natural selection, right? Because it's like, if this idea that the strong survive and the weak die off, that effect will only be stronger when you have a competitive, overpopulated environment. And so this will lead to an increased rate of evolution, an increased rate of change in the species. So Darwin recognized this overpopulation as a very key factor for natural selection. He also said that natural selection has differential reproductive success. That is, that among the different, among all those changes in the individuals, all the variety in the individuals, some will be more successful than others. So this is the idea that the strong survive and the weak are eliminated. And then this kind of leads directly into the fourth factor, which is evolution. And what Darwin meant by that is really a change in allele frequencies of the population. So if you looked at the gene pool, you would notice over time the alleles in that gene pool are changing. Some are becoming more frequent. Some are becoming less frequent. So adaptive traits become more common and maladaptive traits become less common, right, over time. Become less frequent. All right, so there you go. Those are the 4 points of natural selection. Okay, so let's look at some of the evidences of evolution. So, first of all, we've seen evolution occur in our lifetime, actually. Bacteria have evolved antibiotic resistance. And so imagine a dish of bacteria, right? And in here, there is one bacteria that happens to have, I drew it in red. There's one bacteria that happens to have antibiotic resistance. And it's just by chance, by the way, right? This individual, by chance, and that's important, we need to emphasize that, has a mutation that makes it immune to the antibiotic. Okay, now how could that be? Well, the reason it could be is because bacteria, there's so many. If we're talking millions and millions and millions of bacteria, the more of those bacteria you have, the more chance there is that there's going to be a mutation that's beneficial. So we're just saying that this little red bacteria, by chance, happened to get a mutation that gives it resistance. So here's what happens when you introduce the antibiotic introduced. It's going to kill off a huge amount of bacteria. In fact, it's going to kill off almost all of them, except for a couple that happen to survive. And of course, the one bacteria that has the antibiotic resistance will have survived. Now, if this continues a few more times, and there's another drug added, right, then pretty soon the population will be virtually completely consisted of the bacteria with the antibiotic resistance. The more times you apply this environmental challenge, which in this case, this environmental challenge is an antibiotic, the stronger the selection takes place, and pretty soon there's a big change in allele frequencies. In other words, the alleles frequencies starting at the beginning are way different than they are now. And one thing I want to point out is that this mutation, this is a common misconception. A lot of times students think that bacteria will mutate in response to the antibiotic. But as was stated earlier, this mutation was already here. It was already in the population. It just didn't prove its benefit until the drug was introduced, but when it was, it proved to be beneficial, that mutation that was kind of hidden there all along. So anyway, that's an evidence of evolution, bacterial resistance. There's also something called homologous structures. So the best example of this is that the forelimbs in bats, humans, whales, all have the same they all have the same bones. And that's kind of strange because here we have a wing, here we have like an arm, and then here we have a flipper. Yet all three of those are made of the same bones. And yes, they've been modified, but they're the same set of bones. So why would that be? Again, thinking back to if you were creating species instantaneously, wouldn't you just build the flipper out of different bones than you would build a wing? But if we're working with descent with modification, in other words, you can only work with what you have. You have to modify what you already have. Well, if the common ancestor to these three species had a certain set of bones, well, then you have to modify, you have to work with that set of bones. And so this is supports descent with modification. Again, just further support. And common ancestry is what we would call that. Right? Common ancestry of these three species. So let's compare this with what would be called an analogous structure. Or contrasted, I guess we could say. So an analogous structure is kind of different because this would be an example where you've got organs that are the same or almost the same, but have different evolutionary origins. So an octopus eye versus a fish eye have differently located retinas. They have differently placed retinas, which was the first clue that these eyes are not homologous eyes. They're analogous. In other words, they evolved completely independently. So this is not an example of descent with modification. This is an example of the eye evolving twice. And we call this convergent evolution. We'll talk about that in a second in more depth. So just to reemphasize, this is not due to common ancestry. In fact, an octopus and a fish are pretty distantly related. Okay, and then next we have, this is more evidence of evolution, is we have something called vestigial structures, which are remnants from common ancestor. So we believe that humans evolved from primates and that chimpanzees are our cousins. They're our closest living ancestor. Chimps, however, we did not evolve from chimps. That's another common misconception. Rather, so if you have chimps here and humans here, and then a bunch of other, let's say, extinct species of primate, the living, closest related living species to us is chimps. And we, so you'd say that we're cousins because we share a common ancestor somewhere back in time. But we did, as you can see, we did not evolve from chimpanzees. remnants from a common ancestor. So these vestigial traits. So human hair is an example. We kind of have like a piddly amount of hair, like right, like on our arms, we just have like some vestigial hair, is what you'd call that. Human tailbone, perhaps. Basically, like we have a tail, but it's so small, it's diminished. But it used to be a big long tail, right? In whatever primate ancestor we had. And then an example for whales would be like a whale hip bone. So the strangest thing is that you'll find a ball and socket hip, the hip joint, inside of the whale, and then this tiny shrunken little leg. So why are those there? The reason is that they're a remnant of land dwelling ancestor. Or you could look at like a snake's a snake as well has a pelvis, which suggests that the snake used to have 4 legs. Its ancestor had snake's ancestor had limbs, and then those limbs were shrunken, but the pelvis remains. Okay. How about we look at convergent versus divergent evolution? So you have, let's look at this example of fish, ichthyosaur, and dolphin. So here we have a fish. Here we have a reptile. And then here we have a mammal. But if you look at the body plan of all 3 of these species, they all look kind of like a fish. Oops. Wow. Anyway, they all have a dorsal fin. They all have flippers, right? And so the question is, why do they have such a similar body plan? So one possibility is that they share a common ancestor. We'll put that as a question mark, because they don't. And that should be obvious as to why they don't, is because one's a fish, one's a reptile, one's a mammal. So they obviously don't have a recent common ancestor. So instead, body plan, evolution favored this body plan. So it evolved 3 times independently. Okay, so if you looked at a evolutionary tree, let's say these guys would be pretty distantly related. So you might have, say, the ichthyosaur here, and then you might have the fish here, and then you might have the dolphin right here. The point is that these fins, we'll put a little star where these traits evolved. Fins evolved 3 different times for each species, right? It's not as though it evolved once and then was passed on. It evolved, the fins and the dorsal fin and all those features evolved independently. Now let's contrast that with divergent evolution, where we do have common ancestry. So this would be like mammoths and elephants, let's say. And the reason they share many common features because of common ancestry. So it's not as though the tusk evolved twice. or the big feet evolved twice, or the trunk evolved twice. So tusks, trunk, etc. So what this would look like from like on an evolutionary tree would be that like trunk and tusks evolved here, and then hair evolved here, and now you have mammoth, and then you have elephant. So modern day elephant retains the trait of trunk and tusks, but it doesn't have hair, right? That's one possibility of how mammoth and elephant would have so many similarities but one difference. And this is called divergent evolution because right here, this is the point of divergence, right? So genetically, these species here are very closely genetically related, and the DNA evidence supports this. These, even though despite the fact that they look so similar, dolphins and fish are extremely distantly related, very, very distantly related, and the genetic evidence supports that as well. So just because two species look the same, they can look the same for two totally different reasons. So just be careful about that. All right, that's going to wrap up the lecture.